To no one's surprise, the latest Genshin map expansion and world quest, which take place literally on the moon after we fly there in a spaceship, gives us a big dose of lore to go with its heart-wrenching story. But continuing to explore the various dragon facilities outside of the quest gives us so much more information. We learn all about various dragons and their technology, the early history of Teyvat, and we can draw some connections to lore that we learned in previous regions to put together a more accurate timeline of the dragons who used to rule Teyvat. So let's jump right in and start from the beginning. Ibni-Belum is born alongside Teyvat. Unfortunately, we still don't know the mechanism of how that works. I did propose a theory in a previous video that he was originally a being of pure computronium, like Little One becomes in the bad ending of Huitzilopochtli, who discovered a new planet with a primordial sea and restarted his civilization there. But that's just a fan fiction at this point. Ibni-Belum's nature as well as his powers are incredibly confusing at times, ranging from just a really strong and smart dragon to an all-powerful creator deity. And we can see both extremes in the time after the Voyager's visit. The Voyager warns him of the destruction that will overtake the entire universe and asks him to leave and explore the universe with her, but he chooses to stay with his people. His immediate response is to start developing space technology so that the dragons could explore space. But then what does he do? Literally creates 3 moons out of the planet and lifts them into orbit, gives them individual unique identities as the Moon Sisters, and gives them omnipotence over reality itself on Teyvat. Like bro, if you can do that, surely you could just spawn in space-age tech for your people and get this interstellar exploration underway. Instead, he just leaves to explore space himself. Which, again, I guess he can just do that, even though his fellow dragons still didn't have the tech to join him. In his absence, Teyvat is ruled by the 7 dragon sovereigns. 2 of them we know by name, Ysna'qurel and Apep. Neverlet is the current Hydro Dragon, of course, but he's a reincarnation of the original. Then there's still 4 more. Ajdaha is probably one of them, but it's not confirmed. Some people think Dvalin is one, but he is stated to have been born in the heavens, so at most he would be a reincarnation like Neverlet, if he's one at all. We have absolutely no information on the Electro Dragon, though there are fan theories, and the Cryo Dragon we also know nothing about aside from vague references to a dragon in an ancient story, and possibly their bones being used to create the Fae. But we're not going to the Cryo region until next patch, so it's understandable to not know much about them yet. Now, one thing that is unclear is the nature of the elements back then. The Lord of the Night says the heavenly principles created elemental energy, but that's apparently a mistranslation. They actually modified it according to the original Chinese. So while these 7 elements weren't in the same form as they are now, the dragons still had the light realm energy divided up into 7 parts. The description of the prism slime says the creator separated the 7 elements, and Ibni-Belum is referred to as the creator many times throughout this lore. What it actually means to be a sovereign of one of those 7 parts is a bit vague, but we know it carries with it some form of authority to control them, which the heavenly principles later took from the dragons and gave to the 7 archons. But that's still a ways off in our story. As far as the Moon Sisters, they did not take a direct role in ruling Teyvat at all. Their responsibility was to protect Teyvat, not rule it. But the Sisters and the Moons were far beyond the reach of the dragons at first. Outside of the Moongazing world quest, we have a story of the Pyro Sovereign Ysna'qurel going to the moons and visiting the Moon Sisters, and asking what happened to Ibni-Belum. But there's no indication of when that happened. It makes sense to assume it was after Ibni-Belum built the spaceship to the moon, because otherwise Ysna'qurel would have to have the ability to just fly around in lunar orbit himself, and that doesn't seem accurate. Plus, we'll get to some lore later that describes a meeting between Ysna'qurel and the Moongazers, so it's likely those events happened at the same time. What awareness the dragons had of the Moon Sisters prior to the Moongazers is unknown, but we're more concerned with what happened after. So, Ibni-Belum decides to build a spaceship to go to the moons. It's not entirely out of pocket, since as we already covered, Ibni-Belum had the dragons working on spacefaring tech before he left. I'll try not to rehash too much of what we learned as part of the World Quest story, since that was my whole last video. So let's summarize this part by just saying that Ibni-Belum detected a signal from outer space, which he could not decipher, but he thought it was from Ibni-Belum, so he built a device called the Eye of Ibni-Belum to recapture the signal and determine its point of origin. Unfortunately, no other signals came in for the rest of his life. But that's not the only thing that was built on the moon. With Ibni-Belum came a number of other dragon researchers. We have 7 names total, but there were likely many more than that. 2 of them were Magis Geti and Bar Uru Namu Ungin, who we're just gonna call Ungin like everyone else. Those two were lovers who were experts at life science. With their efforts, a biosphere was created on the moon that could support life. Another dragon, named Nuergestug, also came to the moon, though he insists he was not a researcher and just a recorder. Despite that, he worked alongside the dragon researchers and recorded his findings in Newer Stone Circle. Speaking of which, another thing that Ibni-Belum built was the Engraving. This was a massive data storage array on the moon, which can be seen once you complete all the levels of Newer Stone Circle. But there was also a storage node in Niflheim, which is what the dragons called present-day Nod Cry. In fact, it's this massive pillar near the Frostmoon Scion's enclave. Using these, massive amounts of data could be transferred back and forth, so that whatever data they wanted to store would still be preserved on Tevat if something happened to the moon. This is also said to be the birthplace of Columbina, and when we went inside it, it recognized us as Ysna'qurel. Actually, its greeting depends on which quests you've completed. According to the wiki, if you've completed the main Natlan world quests, then it will identify you as Ysna'qurel due to the events of that quest. Otherwise, if you completed the side quest where you meet Ysna'qurel, it identifies her, as you have her core on your person. However, if you haven't done either one, then it still identifies you as some sort of master, but it's redacted. Now, that's an old quest, but I mention it because the same thing happens when you complete Newer Stone Circle. This panel out front will identify you as Ysna'qurel, or Inefa, specifically the Dragon Lord that Inefa used to be, or both, or Ysna'qurel again, or both Ysna'qurel and Ysna'qurel. Or lastly, if you haven't done any precursor quests, as just a friend from afar, which is notably different from the other data node referring to you as a master. This is a pretty cool nod to players who've completed their world quests. Anyway, Ysna'qurel had lengthy chats with Nuergestug, so it makes sense that he has a special greeting in the engraving system. As for what they talked about, we'll get to that later. Only two other things of note happen before Ibni-Belum passes away. One is him expelling Ungien from the research team, and possibly Magisketi too. There's no reason given for why he did that, but it could be because Ungien wasn't enough of a Nibelung fanboy. No, seriously, that's pretty much the only reasoning I can find. That said, this expulsion seemed to be totally pointless, as both Ungien and Magisketi were still on the moon doing their thing. The second thing of note was Ibni-Belum scouting out another celestial body, be it a star or alien planet, which had unnatural construction on it but no signs of life. I mentioned it in my last video, and it doesn't look like there's any other information about it anywhere, so yeah, that's about all there is to say. Next, Ibni-Belum dies of old age, waiting to hear anything else from space. Somewhere around this time, another dragon named Kalag, who is the security chief on the moon, seems to come into power. She doesn't cause any issues just yet, but that changes when the second message is received from outer space. This is all covered in the world quest, so I'll go through it fast. The Moongazers calculate the source of the signal. Ungien decides to go on a one-way trip to hopefully find these aliens and maybe send messages back. Many years pass, and Ungien somehow returns. His ship, called the Moongazer, is coated in a black reflective camouflage substance when it crashes into the space lifeform capture station, and inside the ship is a small black creature excreting the same substance. This was Ungien, fused with an alien entity that they called the Stellar Blackbody, or Containment Object 1. The black substance it secretes is called Blackbody matter. Piecing together different records, we can say that both the alien signals came from the same alien civilization, a world apparently called Throgg and ruled by a godlike being named Ysna'qurel. The alien fused with Ungien is a remnant of that civilization. Thanks to a set of logs found in Magisketi's greenhouse, we know that the following chain of events all happen in rapid succession in the span of only a few months. It's difficult to fit all of the other events we learn about into this short timeline, but I'll do my best. Day 1, Magisketi begins experimenting on Containment Object 1. Over the course of 2 months, they learned that it is Ungien fused with the alien, and he returned bearing a translated message from the aliens, which he communicated by vibrating his body at certain frequencies. This is that message, which ultimately is just a greeting and an encouragement to keep up the fight against the darkness. Magisketi decides that the dragons need to retransmit the message from the Stellar Blackbody back out into space. Somewhere in here, Pyro-Sovereign Ysna'qurel visits the moons. This is presumably when he was trying to gain audience with the Moon Sisters and get answers regarding Nibelung, but he also meets with Nuergestug and discusses the merits of Project Moongazer. He provides some notes on his own research into preserving life as data through phlogiston, and signals his support of the Moongazers. Nuer passes the research along to Lusalim, who is trying to find a way to preserve the Moongazers as data after they pass away, which is ultimately the final part of Project Moongazer. By day 89, the Ungian Blackbody creature was dying. Over a few days, Moongazers extracts some Blackbody matter from the creature and determines that to be the source of its ability to convey information through vibrations. Ninkigia is born when Lusalim uses the power of creation from the Moon Sisters with the data of the Moongazers, including their affections, desires, and ideals. I know it sounds a little random to put Ninin's birth here, but it's the only place it fits based on references to Ninin and Moongazer's condition throughout this timeline. Yes, that means Lusalim figured out how to create this new life in the span of a couple months, and Ninin quickly grew into the dragon Ninkigia. But I suppose the help offered by Ysna'qurel was just that valuable. We learned in Natlan that the dragons could use the power of phlogiston to do stuff like that. Dragon sovereigns are built different, like, what do you want me to say? On day 98, Moongazers confirms that Archaeolune energy, and specifically that which exists inside of dragons, can improve the condition of the creature. Lusalim begins experimenting with moonshade trees and blackbody matter by fusing them together, and determines that a diffusive wave with reflective properties can be projected by this new organism when it is stimulated with Archaeolune energy. Project Lunar Veil is begun to find a way to hide the moon from outside observers. The name came from Ninin, who only recently learned to speak. It was as if she already understood that this project was part of her purpose. This mention of Ninin is why her birth had to have been earlier in this timeline. At Nuer's suggestion, Project Lunar Veil is successfully tested and Ungian Circle is covered by the effect that we see now. Yes, that means Lusalim completed this in under a week. But the research had to have started after Moongazers discovered the reaction between Blackbody matter and Archaeolune energy, and before the next item in the timeline because Lusalim is still reporting to Moongazers. Also note that these moonshade trees look an awful lot like Irminsul. I would suggest that maybe this is exactly what Irminsul is, and the false sky is projected by this exact process being done to Irminsul. But given that Irminsul is gone now and we still have the false sky, we'd have to say that it's actually the ley lines that are functioning like the moonshade trees. That matches more closely with what Kukul Khan said about the relation between the two. On day 107, Lusalim discovers that Moongazers has fallen into a coma from using the energy of her own body to sustain the creature. This is likely the event that converted Ungian Blackbody into the artificial Kuhenki named Ungi. Also, I'm going to assume that when the writers say coma, they don't mean she just passed out for a while. So every single piece of lore that mentions Moongazers being an active participant in Project Moongazer has been put before this point. Because of Moongazers' condition, the Moongazers decide to send out their first message into deep space in accordance with her wishes, which creates additional urgency for the completion of Project Lunar Veil. As a result, Lusalim seeks the aid of the Moon Sisters, as only they had the power to provide the amount of Archaeolune energy that it would require to cover the entire moon. Dendro Sovereign Apep sends help from Moongazers, but to no avail. Neither Apep nor the Moon Sisters can stop the erosion of the soul itself. To take his mind off the situation, Nuer decides to review Project Lunar Veil. He thinks it's a waste of time, and hiding from destruction won't work. So he comes up with another solution, a cognitive hazard that forces the observer to believe they are seeing something they are not, such as seeing a barren rock when they look at Teyvat. Curiously, the exact thing mentioned in Traveler's New Outfit lore back in Luna 4. He tests this by putting an ugly statue of Lusalim in his lab and making Ninkigia believe that it's completely normal. However, as soon as she leaves the lab, the effect wears off, and leads to Lusalim abandoning the idea. Because in order for it to work on Teyvat, the effect would have to extend to the entire universe, which is, of course, impossible. However, he doesn't say it would be impossible to affect the beliefs of an entire world. Day 137. A month later, Security Chief Kalag decides to take full control of the moon and threatens to evict all Moongazers, blaming them for the proliferation of the moonlit vines. She informs all 7 dragon sovereigns of the existence of the stellar black body. Ysna'qurel and Apep already knew, and Ysna'qurel even supported the Moongazers. So, at least one of the other sovereigns must have supported Kalag. Otherwise, there's no way she'd go after a group backed by Ysna'qurel. The next day, Lusalim moves all research materials and Moongazers to his Lunar Veil laboratory. This is the final entry here with a hint of a timeline, so now we move to the destroyed remains of Lusalim's lab. Here, we learn that Lusalim later creates Magi by infusing Magisketi with Archaeolune energy, the same way Magisketi created Ungi. Strangely, he says it must be he who does it, because the experience of creating life will be vital to Project Moongazer, only Lusalim already did that when he created Ninin, which we know happened first because Ninin and Magisketi were alive at the same time. Also, for the record, there is a mistranslation in this text. It calls Magisketi a human being. The original Chinese does not say that, by the way. So this is just a sadly common English version L. Finally, Lusalim obtains the power of the Moon Sisters to project the lunar veil over the entire moon. Doing this is potentially the cause of Archaeolune energy storms, as mentioned in this log. Unfortunately, while the full lunar veil was being tested, Phanes arrives on Teyvat. This caused the lunar veil to be pierced, destroying Lusalim's lab and creating a flood of the Archaeolune energy that had been pooled there to engulf this entire part of the moon. Now, some people assume Phanes did this on purpose, but I find it far more likely that it was an accident. The Moon Sisters told us that the Heavenly Principles were friendly when they first arrived, so immediately showing up and destroying part of the moon doesn't fit. I think Phanes heard that transmission from the Moongazers and came directly to the source, without knowing that some sort of veil was trying to conceal it. Now, before we move on in the story, let's review some of those lore entries I skimmed. The first index contains a series of essay titles that, when looked at together, indicate that the dragons were working on creating life out of data, but that much we can figure out from the quest. He goes on to say that Magisketi's attempt to recreate Ungian's consciousness this way will succeed in creating a conscious being, but it will be a unique being and will never be Ungian. He also talks about how this life of data could be reborn indefinitely, but I was under the assumption that that's just how dragons always worked, the whole thing with the Hydro Dragon Sovereign being reincarnated as Neuvillette, plus this quote from Nicole in the Nod Cry trailer.
In that era, there was no boundary between life and death. Willpower flowed freely among countless beings.
But this moon lore makes it sound like originally dragons were born and died as normal, but eventually converted themselves into data life forms that could reincarnate that way. But considering all this happened before Phanes' arrival, there's no contradiction there. The other one I want to focus on is Index 3. As I said, Newer created a cognitive hazard that could forcibly alter someone's perception. In my last video, I mentioned that this ability to force people to believe certain things could explain how Irminsul causes everyone to accept any change that it makes to the world. But again, since Irminsul is destroyed, the effect should be wearing off, unless it's not actually the source. Plus, I see no reason why Descenders would be an exception to Newer's cognitive contamination, whereas they are an exception to Irminsul's abilities. So let's forget Irminsul, because there's two things in Teyvat that do seem to have been subjected to this cognitive contamination. The first is Teyvat itself. Like I said, Newer even mentions using this effect to cause Teyvat to appear as a barren rock. Well, as implied in the As Heaven and Earth Are Made Anew lore, that is in fact how Teyvat appears now. So Phanes must have found a way to make the disguise effective, where Newer thought it would be impossible. The second thing, and this harkens back to a theory I stated in my Unsolved Mysteries video, and then restated in my Temple of Space video, Paimon. The theory was that there's some passive effect she has that makes people not question her existence. Well, now we have a literal explanation for that exact effect right here in the lore. Also, shout out to Skirk, who has a similar but opposite effect where people can acknowledge her, but she somehow edits herself out of their memories as soon as she leaves. The straight-up modification of people's cognition is now a confirmed thing in the lore, and it seems like Newer just invented it on a whim, like it wasn't even hard to do. That's all the pre-Phanes stuff I want to go over. So now let's get to the aftermath. The lore on the moon skips from when Phanes pierced the lunar veil, which, as I explained before, I think was just an accident, all the way to after they conquered Teyvat and populated it with humans, because the next things chronologically are the Moon Sister memories. As neat as it is to see more Moon Sister interactions, we don't get a lot of new lore here. The first thing is confirmation as to why the Moon Sisters look human when they are creations of Ibni-Belum. The answer is because they chose to, in order to blend in. The second is an odd hint that Istaroth might not be loyal to Phanes. Of course, we don't know what this feeling is or whether it's good or bad, but I feel like the only reason this line would be in the game is if the writers are hinting that things are not the way they seem between Istaroth and Phanes. This would mean that pretty much none of the Shades are entirely loyal. Renova is the closest, but she defied the Heavenly Principles when she helped Natlan. Nabirius is just Rhine-daughter now, and she's certainly not loyal. Then obviously, Asmodee is Asmodee. Istaroth already did something defiant when saving Tsibai, and guiding the people of Enkanomiya, and planting the sacred Sakura in the past, and sending Traveler's spaceship key back in time, and sheesh, this girl just does whatever she wants. Speaking of Tsibai, the next lore reference is the Moon Sisters talking about the Lunar Envoys. There's nothing new here, but it's nice to see them mention Tsibai by name, even if the English localizers misspell it. And the last thing is their final interaction, where they clarify that the Angels' Rebellion and the War of Funerary Flame are two separate events. This was already confirmed in Luna 4 the last time the Moon Sisters spelled this out, but here we see canon making the decision to guide the survivors of Hyperborea, who would eventually become the Frost Moon Scions. We heard about this already when we first got to Nod Cry, but now we can actually see the moment canon makes the decision. Before I move on, I want to go back to one little detail I skimmed. Canon says she needs to discuss Tevat's laws of time with Istaroth, but more interesting is the wording she uses. Gravitational potential and metric tensor. Extreme gravity is one thing that can alter the flow of time by literally bending space-time, and a metric tensor is a mathematical tool used to calculate the effects of that curvature. This implies Ibni-Belum did something with Tevat's gravity to alter the way time works here, and it's not the same as the rest of the universe. I would suggest something like Tevat existing in its own isolated pocket of space-time, and that's how it resists abyssal incursion so well, but I'm not exactly sure how that would work. We have too many instances of beings and messages entering and leaving Tevat for it to be that straightforward. I'm sure we'll find out at the end of the Tevat chapter. It's just a matter of if we can figure it out before then. And yeah, I know people are going to say it's a bubble universe on the Honkai Imaginary Tree or whatever, but I will continue to treat Genshin as its own separate thing until Fuhua shows up, and I won't accept anything less because she's best girl. Anyway, between Phanes' arrival and Ibni-Belum's return, we don't get too much more lore. We know that Lusalim ultimately hands all of his research regarding the Lunar Veil to Phanes, and that's almost certainly how the False Sky came to be. Nuer's cognitive contamination also seemed to fall into Phanes' possession. The main issue with both of these projects was an energy source. Both of them were just working with Archaeolune energy, and that didn't seem like enough to protect Tevat, but Phanes found a way to pull it off. How? Before I state a theory, let's read one more thing. This note that we can read before the second Moon Sister interaction. Chanson of the Boatman. It was written by a boatman, someone who ferried the souls of the dead to the moons. It seems at this time, Phanes had just made the switch from the dead going to the moons to the dead going into the Leylines and Irminsul. And Euthyphro of Arcadia, this boatman who ferried souls to Prusmene, which is evidently what the people of Arcadia called Kennen, now begs her to take him to the moon when he dies rather than letting him descend beneath the silver tree. He makes it sound like the moon afterlife is paradise, whereas the Irminsul afterlife is more akin to oblivion. So here's the theory. The Heavenly Principles use the souls of the dead to power their technology on Tevat. In fact, that might also be what Archaeolune energy is to some degree. When they took over the Leylines and Irminsul, they converted them into a system that turns people into energy. We've been on a sci-fi kick recently, but consuming souls puts us firmly back into fantasy. But hey, it's just a theory. Another theory based on a couple lines from Euthyphro's message, where he says the Primordial One wants to usher in an age without beginning or end. This reminds me of the whole time loop idea that keeps recurring in Genshin. We've got tons of mentions of Samsaras, where the same story keeps repeating. We've had events in-game that can't really be explained outside of time travel shenanigans, like the spaceship key, Columbina's time reversal, and the sacred Sakura. The theme of a time loop appears a lot, but there's not any real evidence that I see of the entire world being in an actual time loop. Aside from those few instances of a single object or person seeming to travel travel back in time, all the history we know plays out in a pretty straight line so far. Then again, the history we know is meaningless given Irminsul's former abilities, so the Traveler and consequently we players would have no way of knowing anything that truly happened before the start of the game. A time loop would play well with my suggestion before about Teyvat existing in its own spacetime, one in which Phanes created a microcosm of the world which loops on itself endlessly, preventing anything like the Abyss from destroying it, since the Abyss would just get reset at the end of the loop with everything else. But that still doesn't explain the things that leave and enter Teyvat not seeming to notice anything special, besides the false sky. Here's a silly idea. What if the entire universe is actually in a time loop, and somehow the Dark Destroyer that everyone fears is Sertologi, and at the end of the universe he loops back to the beginning and becomes the Dark Destroyer, and eventually recreates himself on Teyvat? Yeah, I think it's ridiculous too. But it's too soon to rule anything out yet. As I mentioned in my Celestial Gift video, time travel is confirmed possible in the universe. Voyager's civilization did it to witness the end of the universe and then come back. Speaking of which, in a previous video I suggested that the Athame artist description of a world in a constant cycle of light and dark, which had a warrior who created an outpost to stop the cycle from happening, and then the Little Witch destroyed the outpost so the cycle could resume. Yeah, that world was the entire universe. And the outpost was Teyvat, and the warrior was Phanes. In fact, maybe the reason the story of Ysna'qurel, ruler of Throgg, sounds so similar to Phanes conquering Teyvat is because it is Phanes and Teyvat from a previous loop of the universe. But I feel like I'm dropping way too many correct theories that I don't intend on supporting, so let's get back to talking about moon lore. That said, we're about to the end of the new lore drops. Ibni-Belum returns, turns the moons into giant cannons that contain Lucilim's lab. Lucilim presumably dies or is killed for being a traitor who turned his research over to the Heavenly Principles, and Ninkigia finishes Project Moongazer. All the dragons live on as data that gets reborn from time to time due to the power of creation given to the Moongazers by the Moon Sisters. And a Black Kuhenki eventually learns enough to send another message out into space. And that continues even after Phanes tosses the moon outside the firmament. Given that these Kuhenki effectively are data life forms, the message is probably themselves, which is why they disappear upon sending it. And it explains why Lucilim thought he was going to journey into the stars after he died. And then the next thing that happens is Columbina, and then the Traveler, who simultaneously does and does not remember that they received this message in their spaceship. Listening to the recording, they clearly understood the message they received to some degree, and even repeated the same line back about meeting beneath the starry skies. That's from the dragons. The original message didn't have that line. It ended after the ray of light piercing the night like the dawn line. And yet here's Traveler, acting like they had no clue what the message said. I'm pretty sure Traveler's memories are cooked. So there's just one last thing to talk about. Yeah, it's this. The original message that Ibni-Belum received, which made him construct the Eye of Ibni-Belum in the first place. Back then the dragons couldn't understand it, but they kept a record of the exact message, and when Ninkigia took over the project, she finally translated it. So let's summarize the important parts. Ninkigia begins by herself summarizing a massive essay within the message, which apparently detailed the Origin civilization's entire history. This took place on a world named Throgg. Notably, we have an immortal named Ysna'qurel, defeating 7 beings to take over the world. Where have I heard that before? The entity also appears to be androgynous. Familiar. Much later, their civilization also receives a message about the Dark Destroyer, and they're like, oh shucks, I guess we're dead. Ysna'qurel ultimately decides to send out a messenger to warn other civilizations, because the Dark Destroyer will find and destroy them regardless. Ninkigia doesn't know if this is the same civilization that the stellar Blackbody came from, but I feel like the log inside the Moongazer confirms that it was. The entity that fused with Ungian was likely the messenger they sent. So yeah, there's a lot there that reminds us of Phanes, but are they actually related? hard to say. I still think Phanes was a member of Voyager's civilization, for the sole fact that those chroniclers saw every outcome in the universe. And yet, what Phanes did to Teyvat was not in their calculations. The only way that's possible is if Phanes also saw those outcomes and purposely did something different. Although, I guess if you want to sign on to that crack theory where Phanes is a survivor from the previous loop of the universe, that could explain it too, I guess. The last thing I want to mention is a correction from my last video, thanks to a commenter. I said that the Dark Sea is completely empty, but so is Ungian Circle. Except it's not. Add in the fact that apparently many dragons fled to the Dark Sea, and it's entirely possible there's a hidden dragon base out there. I'm reminded of when Kukulkan said that there are enough dragons left on Teyvat today to overthrow the 7 Archons. But where they at though? Well, I guess they're all still hiding in the Dark Sea. Alrighty, that's all I can think to explain in this video. It's entirely possible I forgot some things because it's been a while between playing through all this content and actually writing this script, and I've spent most of that time playing Palworld. So yeah, my memory might not be the best. Feel free to mention any other cool things you noticed or any theories you have relating to some of the lore in the quest. I'll probably livestream my playthrough of the Snezhnaya Archon quest, so subscribe if you want to get in on that. Or if you like my videos in general and want to see more. Thanks for watching.